You know, the goal of this channel is to really help you become experts at what you do. And that's why today's video is going to be about quick tips for writing better performing SQL queries. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about tips for how to write better performing SQL queries. Now, if we're going to talk about performance, it probably makes the most sense to start with understanding how we can go about measuring the performance of our queries. All right. So the first command I want to talk about is set statistics IO. Okay, because typically when you're experiencing long-running queries or performance issues with queries, it's typically going to be centered around IO. All right. So one thing you can do is, before you run your query, is type set statistics IO on. You only have to run this once per session, okay? So we'll run that. Now that's turned on. We could comment that out. All right, and now let's write a simple query. So let me just have one prepared here. And we're going to select email addresses from our email address table. And I'm just using the AdventureWorks database. That's a sample database that you can get for free and download for SQL Server. All right, so we're going to say where we want to search for every email address. Oh, I don't know. Let's start with James. All right, so we'll check the left 5 characters. And those have to equal James. Okay. All right, so now let's go ahead and run this. All right, so there's our email addresses. But let's click the Messages tab over here. And now you'll notice you'll see these statistics here. Okay, you'll see scan count, but then you'll see, and this is what I focus on, you'll see logical reads and physical reads. Okay, this is really where you want to focus, and this is what I think really tells the story about how your query is performing, especially in relation to other queries. Okay, logical reads, now those are basically your reads from RAM or memory, okay, cache. And physical reads are obviously the number of reads coming from a physical disk, right? So this is pretty much how you can gauge how your queries are performing. Okay, I'll show you some other methods later. But aside from just looking at the time in seconds in the lower right corner, right, this is a way where you can really understand how your query is performing. Okay. Now, but there's another thing I want to focus on here for a second. Let's focus on this query here. Now, let's do another thing. Okay, we're going to rerun this query, but let's include our live query statistics. So it's an option on the toolbar. So we'll check that. Okay, and we'll rerun this. And now I want to break this query down for a second, right? So notice what we're doing here. Okay, we're using a function on one of our columns here. Okay, so we're taking the left 5 characters. All right, and now let's focus on the bottom here. You'll see it's doing an index scan. So scans are typically not what you want to see, right? A scan is really where it's actually scanning the index, so scanning every row, okay? And that's because we use this function here, okay? So what this function does is it forced the query to evaluate this condition or this function for every row, okay? That's why you're seeing an index scan here. So it's typically going to be worse performing, okay? And now remember this logical reads 186. Okay, remember that number for a second. Because now we're going to rewrite this query. Okay, and I'll write it down beneath it. So I'll copy and paste this. So what's a better way to write this query? And again, these are simple queries, but this is something you definitely always want to be aware of. Okay, or at least know and understand. All right, so a better way to write this query would be to use like. So get rid of the function, and we'll replace this with a like and the percent sign. Okay, so this will give us the same results, but now let's rerun this. Okay, and now you see down here, if you focus at the bottom, it's doing an index seek. So it's no longer doing a scan, which is great. That's better. That's what you want to see. Now let's check our reads. Now look, our logical reads are down to 4 from, I think the previous number was 186. Okay, so here's a couple of quick tips here on how to write better performing queries. All right, so I mentioned one method being you can look at the time in the bottom right-hand corner that the query typically takes to run. But what if a query runs in under a second, right? What if there's multiple ways to write a query and they both run in under a second? So you can't really use a timer, okay? How can you determine which one's better, right? Because maybe they run so quickly because there's not that many rows in the table, but you expect the rows to grow very, very quickly, okay? So you want to make sure that the query that you write is the best performing query, okay? So another option is to type set statistics time on, okay? So let's execute this command. Okay, I'll comment that out. You only need to execute it once per session, all right? Now, okay. Now let's see what this does. So I have a query prepared here. All right, let's run this query. All right, so there's the execution plan, but let's look at messages. All right, so you can see this will return the time in milliseconds, all right? Because if you look at the bottom right, this ran in about a second, okay? But there's another way we're going to write this query, and that'll run in about a second too. So how do we know which one's better? All right, so this one ran, we'll just do elapsed time, 32 milliseconds, okay? All right, so, the other thing I want to point out is, let's look at the way this is written, okay? So we're selecting where sales order ID is in, and we're using a subquery here, okay? So we're selecting a bunch of sales order IDs based on certain date criteria, okay? But what's a better way to write this, okay? How can we rewrite this to be a better performing query? Well, we can use exists, okay? So instead of using in with a subquery, we can simply use exists. So let's rewrite this query. And I'll copy and paste this below it. All right. Let's hide the results pane. All right. So what we're going to do is let's get rid of this part. Actually, you know what? I'll retype the whole thing. All right. So we'll do where exists. All right. And now we'll type our subquery. We'll reuse this. And we'll just do select star. You don't need to select specific fields. It doesn't matter when you're using exists. It's not looking for any particular field. It's just looking for a result. Okay. But now what can we do? How do we link this, right? Well, alias this table. We'll alias this table. And now we'll join these two tables in the where clause. Okay. So we'll say where the date modified. We'll keep the date criteria, and we'll do end a dot sales order ID equals b dot sales order ID. So this will give us the same results. The only difference is instead of using sales order ID in, okay, and making the query match this up to the sales orders that get returned here in this result set, we're just using exists. So say, listen, if there's any result where this equals this, okay, where these sales IDs match, any result at all, we want those results, right? Now let's run this. And we got it down to 8 milliseconds. Same amount of logical reads, but again, better performing query. We got it down to 8 milliseconds, and the first time it ran, it was even longer than that, the other query. Okay? So again, little tips for writing better performing queries. Use exists where possible. Thanks so much for watching, but please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell.